What's up, and welcome to Complete Nonsense, where we take the latest news and trends and show you the money side of it. We're your hosts. I'm Lindsay coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts, and this is my friend and colleague, Ben Richardson, coming to you from North Carolina. Today, we have our first special guest, Sarah Foster, coming to you from New York City. Sarah's an economy reporter at Bankrate and has been a friend and colleague for the last 4 years. Thanks for joining us, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited. This is my first podcast appearance, so I am ready to roll. Which
It's gonna be great.
Could that be a money joke in itself? Maybe I'm already rolling with the puns.
We love it. Ben, tell us what we've got coming today.
Yeah, for sure. So we've actually got a lot to talk about. We're going to be talking about the housing market and how we got here, whether or not we should be saving or paying down debt right now. And also we're going to talk about the job outlook. But before we go on, don't forget to like, share, comment on whatever platform you're watching this from. But that's enough about that. Let's jump on into the housing market. Sarah, I am so interested from your point of view, like, what's going on with the housing market right now? Like, can you give us like a snapshot?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit rough out there, I would say, especially for younger Americans. I think, we have to kind of trace back first why it is such a tough housing market. We say tough housing market, and Americans are like, I've been dealing with this for 3 years. In the coronavirus pandemic, there was a huge housing shortage where the virus kind of disrupted the flow of sales. It disrupted, that typical face-to-face interaction that you see when you are in the market for buying a home. It kind of resulted in weighing on some of these other demographic challenges too, I think, where we really, since the Great Recession, builders were underbuilding as well. So there was already long-running housing shortages. But now you fast forward to today, and we're kind of dealing with the flip side of this, where simultaneously, home prices are expensive. Mortgage rates are at the highest in over 2 decades. And we're seeing really these groups of people who have long struggled to afford to buy a home. I'm thinking about these perennial underdogs of home buying, which, are younger Americans. It's getting even tougher for them than it was before.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I'm a home buyer. I sold right before the pandemic. I bought during the pandemic, and I've done a HELOC post-pandemic here in 2023. So I've experienced a lot of this, and so it's definitely a fascinating time to be a home buyer.
What was it like for you? Sorry, Lindsay.
No. Say that again?
I was going to say, what was it like for you selling your home in the pandemic? I mean, were you in the middle of bidding wars?
So when I sold our home, we sold our home right before the pandemic started, literally the month before the pandemic hit. So I sold, and when the pandemic hits, I'm like, oh man, we just escaped a miracle. Like, we were able to get out of our house. We got a good price on it and all that. Fast forward, a year, 2 years later, the market never stopped. Like, the prices kept going up. And so I'm like, oh man, we could have sold our house for more. And, so hindsight's 2020, right? But it was definitely an interesting experience buying a home back in 2021 was interesting because how much the market continued to increase. Interesting story, and I promise I won't make this long. The house I sold in 2020, I moved, came back, bought a house in the exact same neighborhood, the exact same style house, but I paid almost $20,000 more for a house that needed a lot of work. And so that was in 1 year, that was the difference. And then that was in 2021. And then fast forward now, 2023, just 2 years later, we have almost $150,000 in equity now because the housing market continues to go up and home prices continue to go up in our area. So very, very fascinating.
That's interesting that you said that, because the median sale price for homes right now is $407,000, just over $407,000.
Well, I don't even know, what is that? I don't even want to guess what that means in terms of like what the monthly payment is now with interest rates, what they are, but I can tell you it's not what it was 2 years ago. I was able to get in, luckily, with one of those rates around that 3% mark. And that's a pipe dream for home buyers today, I feel like.
Now mortgage rates are approaching almost 8%, which is crazy. And I can't even fathom being a home buyer right now, just because your mortgage rate and payment is going to be so astronomical. Like, Sarah, can you tell us from an economic perspective what this means for home buyers?
Yeah, well, never in US history have we really seen mortgage rates climb at this fast of a pace. Really, we were looking at a record low of 2.93% on the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage in our Bankrate data. That was back in 2021. Today, it surged to about 7.8%, which is the highest since December 2000. And, the reason why mortgage rates are rising is because interest rates across the board are rising. The Federal Reserve
Yeah.
has been raising interest rates at the fastest pace in 40 years. It's changing the way investors are making money decisions. We see the 10-year Treasury yield, which is another interest rate benchmark, that's kind of guiding these mortgage rates higher. And, we thought that this was kind of the secret here. One way
Yeah.
to weigh on home prices is to raise interest rates, but that's not really happening. And in fact, it's creating even bigger affordability challenges. And just kind of doing calculations before I came on this podcast, I was looking at, what would it cost someone to finance a $500,000 mortgage on a 30-year fixed rate? And at 2.93%, that was going to cost a little more than $2,000 a month.
Yeah.
Today at 7.8%, that's costing pretty close to $3,600.
Oh
So it's a
my.
72% increase, all because
That's
of
wild.
mortgage rates.
Well,
That's
Sarah, I'm
crazy.
going to tell you, like you're so fascinating to listen to because you have all this information in your head. I'm like a sixth grader right now trying to keep on like, oh, this is like really fun. Two practical questions that I actually have from this is one, do you think the rates will continue? Like you mentioned 7.8%. Like, is there a chance we're going to see it hit, 8%? Like, is that even a possibility? I'm just curious.
It's certainly possible. I mean, something that we've been seeing right now is really a sell-off and turmoil in the bond market. I mean, the
Right.
10-year Treasury yield, which is, as I mentioned earlier, it's the benchmark for this 30-year fixed rate mortgage, that's surged in the past week to the highest since 2007. And if
Wow.
these rates
Wow.
continue to climb, we could see that result in higher mortgage rates. And really,
Huh.
the barometer for lower interest rates is really cooling inflation. Investors, when they see that inflation lingers for longer, they change the decisions that they make. Cooling inflation and really a slowing economy are kind of the precipice for falling mortgage rates. And that's really just not something that we've seen right now. And in fact, I think investors are really kind of grappling with the fact that, the Federal Reserve is nowhere near close to
Yeah.
cutting interest rates. And as
Mm.
they kind of get accustomed to that reality,
Which brings
that
up,
could result in higher interest rates.
so it's really interesting you say that because I think a lot of home buyers are hopeful that like rates are going to drop and that's going to be this. I mean, anybody who's looking for a home right now, that's their hope is that it happens. But like, can we kind of explain like what would happen if interest rates were just to drop suddenly? How would that impact markets? I mean, I have to imagine that that would create a buying frenzy. I have to believe that it would impact renters. So I'm just curious from your standpoint, how would that, if it were to happen drastically, what would that mean for everyday consumers?
Yeah, it's a case of maybe being careful what you wish for,
Mm.
because I see especially on social media, I mean, memes out there from young Americans who have felt left behind, and rightfully so. I see memes out there praying for a crash in the housing market, but that really is kind of synonymous with tougher economic environments, because if you're in an instance where interest rates are dropping, you're likely living through an economic crisis, not
Mm.
unlike the Great Recession. And I kind of even look at the Great Recession as one of these instances that demonstrates just how much the economy can leave scars on Americans' wallets, because we saw one of the reasons why, the economy took so long to recover from the Great Recession is because so many Americans, it took them a long time to recover their wealth. Their home values dropped, their
Yeah.
investments and their 401ks dropped. And if that kind of environment is really the precipice for a cheap, housing market, something that's affordable, it's probably going to make it even harder for Americans to be able to afford to buy a home because of the income side when it comes to, having a good job.
Yeah. Well, for
Yeah.
you guys, I know both of y'all, like Lindsay, you're up in Boston and
Yeah.
Sarah, you're in New York. What's it like there? Like what's the environment like there in terms of the housing market? Is it super competitive right now? What are you guys seeing?
Oh yeah. I mean, I rent, so I'm not looking to buy a home yet, but I've seen houses go up for sale and they stay up for sale for so long in our neighborhood because the prices are just so high,
Yeah.
and then people get
Yeah.
outbid. One of my friends bought a home last year, and she was in a bidding war with someone, and paid almost over $50,000 more than she wanted to because of the housing prices.
Super
and just
common.
trying to get a home. Yeah.
Super common. I'll tell you, when I was looking for my home, we put 5, 6 offers on different houses. We were coming in $20,000 above asking, and still we're not even anywhere close to being competitive. We were losing out to bids that were cash offers that were 60 grand above asking. And I'm, as a, young family, I'm like, how can I compete with this? It's tough. And I don't know, Sarah, what's it like for you in New York?
New York is one of those housing markets where I feel like even in a tougher economy, how much realistically could some of these homes fall in price? I mean, how homes are going for millions of dollars here. That's kind of just the way it is here for people thinking, is it possible for me to buy a home? Part of my job here at Bankrate is really being on the ground and making sure I'm talking to people who are going through the home buying process right now. And I hear from real estate agents, they say that homes aren't staying on the market for seconds anymore. They're lasting a little bit longer, maybe, weeks or months at the most. But it's still a tough market out there, and it's still a seller's market largely. And I think it's interesting kind of looking at these younger Americans who, first-time home buyers, the median age, the average age actually of someone who, the first time typical home buyer is 36 years old, which is the oldest on record.
Wow.
I feel like I saw that on with the National Association of Realtors. I think that stat was there, which blows my mind. I mean, 36 years old for a first-time home buyer. It's not home buyer average. It's first time home buyer. And that, you said that's the oldest on record?
Yeah, oldest on record. So you're really seeing, when you think about the Americans who are positioned to deal with this housing market, they're likely individuals who already own a home. They're able to utilize the equity that they've built up to afford to be able to buy something that's at an inflated price. Whereas these Americans who haven't been able to yet crack the housing market, they're coming from a much further starting point. They're much more vulnerable. And I think about what this means too for the economy. I think inflation within shelter and housing, that has been one of the most prominent factors of inflation lately. And if you see all of these home buyers waiting on the sidelines, unable to afford to buy a home, that could have consequences for rents too. One of the reasons why rent is so expensive in New York, and I'm curious for you, Lindsay, too, is because so many Americans are, resigned to it.
If you guys want to take a move down south, we welcome you here in the state of North Carolina.
I would love to be on the beach there then.
Same. I might have to take you up on that offer. But Sarah, you talked a little bit about some of the hurdles that home buyers were facing. Do you think that the down payment is still the biggest hurdle for Americans and home buyers today, or is it something else, the mortgage rates or something else?
Yeah, well, I think, one maybe misconception about down payments is that you have to have a 20% down payment, and actually conventional mortgages require much less than that. So it is something to look into. But one of the things and the continued biggest hurdles that I often hear from Americans, and maybe even first-time home buyers or younger Americans themselves, is their student loan debt. One of the ways that you qualify for, the most competitive mortgage rate out there is if you keep a low debt to income ratio. Some of these Americans who are borrowing an upwards of $30,000 in student loan debt, that's just the average. That can keep them on the sidelines, maybe result in having them paying an even more expensive mortgage rate than they would have if they didn't have the student loan debt. But it's a catch-22 because that student loan debt is also, contributing to their ability to afford an education, to pursue a higher paying job, and even remain employed more likely during recessions.
So consumers are facing this wall now of home ownership, but I also know that home ownership is really like a primary path to accumulating wealth. So this is going to have future impacts as well that aren't even relevant just to this year or next year, but for years to come, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Fed data actually shows that the median net worth of a homeowner is 40 times that of a renter.
Wow.
This is, buying a home really is the way, historically speaking, that Americans have been able to build wealth, not just for themselves, but for their families and future generations.
So
do you
think, is home ownership still, is that still the American dream? Like, do you feel like that's still it?
We saw in survey data that Lindsay
Yeah, 74% of Americans consider ownership a key component of the American dream.
Yep.
And what's even more amazing is that 66% of Gen Z and millennials said this as well, which is kind of surprising to me that these younger generations still consider this to be the American dream. I think
Yeah.
it'd be something else, like maybe getting a high paying job or saving for retirement and being able to retire comfortably.
Well, you do see a decline with the Gen Z and millennial, as opposed to the average of, I think you said, what was it? What was the overall percentage you mentioned? 74%.
74, yeah.
So it's 74% and 66. You do see a slight decline. And I just wonder how much of it is around generational. Like, I feel like the younger generation is very big on experiences, things like that. And I'm curious how much of an impact that has.
The way I think about it is actually, younger Americans are doing a lot of things later in life. They're getting married later in life. They're having children later in life. Some of that could be because of economic disadvantages. Maybe their student loan debt. We've seen that in Bankrate surveys that their student loan debt is keeping them from starting families. But a lot of times, these paths towards pursuing higher paying jobs, towards bolstering your income opportunities, that actually lays the groundwork for you to be able to buy a home eventually, just maybe a little bit later in life than some of these other generations were afforded. And something that also kind of stands out to me too is, it's related to that stat that you brought up, Lindsay, is, we saw in recent Bankrate data too, that younger generations are actually more likely than older generations to say they'd be willing to make major sacrifices to buy a home. That could be, taking on roommates, living with family members, moving farther away from, your job or your family members. And I think that kind of demonstrates that a lot of younger Americans do want to buy a home, but they're just kind of grappling with what home ownership is going to look like for them.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of people right now that are battling kind of like, saving for a down payment. Like I do think that's probably a hurdle. It may not be the only hurdle. I think there's a lot of outliers that can play into a factor of that. But it kind of brings up another question, kind of moving out of home ownership. But like, should consumers right now be saving money right now, or should they be paying down debt? Like that, I feel like that's a huge question right now for consumers that we need to put a little spin on and help people understand what's going on. So Sarah, I'd be really interested on your take on this, just from an economic point of view and with inflation and the times we're living in. What's your standpoint there?
Yeah, I would say that Americans, we have long known that many Americans have lived paycheck to paycheck. That was even before the coronavirus pandemic began, back in 2019, when we were seeing arguably the best job market at the time in half a century. So I think what's something that is important to kind of recognize is that, lots of Americans are struggling with this ability to make this choice. And then adding on inflation, which is basically like taking a pay cut, it makes it even harder to kind of pursue these important financial steps. And the one stat that really stands out to me from, surveys that we've looked at is that 68% of adults are saying that they're saving less for emergencies because of inflation.
Wow.
And, emergency funds are important for a wide variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is because it's kind of the buffer between you and credit card debt. And credit card rates are hitting record highs. They have been since last fall. So this question of, saving or paying down debt kind of ends up being you chasing a tail, especially when you get into this really tough environment of not being able to save to begin with.
You talked a little bit about emergency funds, and I know from working at Bankrate, they recommend 3 to 6 months of emergency savings. Do you think that's still feasible in today's economy, or does it depend on your financial situation?
I think it definitely depends on your financial situation. Obviously, we would love it at Bankrate if everybody could build up 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, have any kind of buffer here of expenses in an emergency fund. But the thing I try to remind Americans is I try to also be realistic and help Americans realize that they can celebrate these small goals.
Yeah.
I think concentrate maybe on saving your first $50 first and consider that a win. Maybe move that up to 100 later.
That's a really valid point, Sarah, because I think for me, I remember going through this whole process of like getting my emergency fund saved up and, beginning with $1,000. To me, like that was a major feat at some point in time. Like getting to $1,000 was like, I mean, it took me a long time to get there. And so when you'd hear the 3 to 6 months of savings for your living expenses, it overwhelmed me so much. I felt almost immediately defeated. So I appreciate the advice on celebrating the small things, and whether it's 3 months, 6 months out, whatever you can get. But I think every little bit matters, and I think that's a really good point. Lindsay, you had mentioned a little bit about this, but like 22% of Americans haven't contributed to their retirement savings in the past year. Is this a continued part of inflation, do you think, Sarah, that people are just their wallets are feeling a little bit tight right now, and so that's the contribution? Is it more of the risk of that they want to pull it back, and are they trying to invest it? Like how are Americans using their funds right now, and trying to protect themselves for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have seen I mean, it's really no coincidence that we've seen household debt on the rise at the same time as inflation. I think it's really these Americans who couldn't really afford to save in the beginning, who automatically, I mean, always live paycheck to paycheck, who have very few discretionary expenses that they can cut back on. They're the ones who are most vulnerable when prices rise, because it often results in these tough choices that they have to make, either turning to a credit card to finance your day-to-day expenses,
Yeah.
cutting back on
Yeah.
your investing contributions. And I have a lot of fun with math. So I
I'm
did
glad you
this.
do. It's
Yeah.
not my area.
It's not mine
Uh,
either.
But I
I
feel like we're seeing, with that, when they're assuming, and my heart really goes out to families living, in the paycheck to paycheck right now, because it's not a fun place to be in. It's nobody wants to be in that position to begin with. But then when you start throwing all these other things, resorting to credit card debt, where credit card rates are historically high right now, it just feels like a little bit of a, recipe where people just need the right guidance to do things. So even on the savings side, like, there's also some really good opportunities to save right now. And I'd be interested, Lindsay, yours or Sarah's take on like some of those savings opportunities that are available right now for consumers.
I think the best advice, and I tell this to everyone, is to open a high yield savings account. That was
Yep.
the best thing I did when I first started working at Bankrate. I looked on our site and I compared all the options that were there. I think now rates are approaching almost 5%, maybe even
Yeah.
higher at this
Yeah.
point. So let your money work for you. If it's in a checking account or savings account that's earning no interest, it's the difference between earning $1 on your savings in a year or
Yeah.
$100.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. I actually did the same thing. This year was a year of challenging myself to help my money like work for me instead
Yeah.
of me always working for my money. And so I was the same thing. I went on Bankrate. I was able to navigate one of the tools and kind of do a comparison of what kind of interest rates were out there. I found an APY that was really good for me, and it had given me a yield on my savings that I have not seen in a long time. So to me, it was historic. I was excited about it, and finally starting to see some of that yield come through month over month is actually really exciting to see, even if it's a minimal savings amount for me.
I feel like having a high yield savings account is a little bit like, I don't know, it's like a conversation starter when you work at Bankrate. You're
Yeah,
always like going up to your coworkers, like,
yeah,
where do you bank?
yeah,
What's
yeah,
your yield?
Yeah.
Should
yeah,
I be moving my money to get a
yeah.
higher yield? It's fun.
But it's
It's
actually
free
fun to
money.
know, and you're normalizing conversations around money,
Yeah.
right? I think for such a long time, like conversations about money have just been like kind of on the hush, like you don't talk about it. I grew up in a family, we didn't really talk about it. You kind of know the status of where you are based on what meal you're eating. If we're just eating, ramen noodles today, I know kind of where we were at. But it's not to speak illy of it. It's just you kind of recognize it. But we never talked about money growing up. I don't know for you guys if that was a conversation around the dinner table or not, but it certainly wasn't for me.
It wasn't a lot for me either. I think my grandpa like instilled a lot of good money advice
Yeah.
for me and like helped me. He was like, always save your first paycheck and you're gonna have it years later, which I've taken with me. And I don't know if I still have it. I probably do, but it's just been good
That's brilliant.
advice. And I always love talking about money with him because he always had the best advice.
Yeah. Actually, it's really interesting you say that, because actually my grandfather was one that talked to me about money probably more than anybody,
Yeah.
which I appreciate because of the wisdom they've accrued over all these years. I think they're wanting to embark that on the younger generation. And I know for me personally, I'm trying to do the same, even with my kids now who are, 10 and 12 years old, opening accounts for them, trying to help them understand checking and savings accounts and even
Yeah.
investment accounts, like really trying to teach them young, because their minds are sponges right now. So I was like, now I have the best opportunity to try and help them. But it's just been really interesting to navigate. So Great recommendation on the high yield savings account. I truthfully, when somebody told me high yield savings, I had no clue what they were talking about. All I knew was checking and savings. That was it. I knew nothing about high yield. Again, I thought CDs were what I put in my old car. Like there's so much to learn here at Bankrate. I love it.
Yeah, yeah.
I love that too. Now I think we have our work cut out for us with saving money, paying down debt, but I want to shift gears a little bit to the job market outlook, Sarah. What is going on with jobs right now? Where are the highest paying jobs? Like, can you just give us a little rundown of that?
Yeah, the job market, I think, has been easiest described as a juggernaut. It's white hot. I think technically in science, the science people got to keep me honest, but I think white is technically a hotter color than red. So that's why we use white hot. It's really, since the Federal Reserve has started raising interest rates, we have all been waiting for the shoe to drop. We've been wondering, when are more Americans going to start losing their jobs? When is hiring going to slow? When are employers going to stop creating as many jobs? And unfortunately, could it be possible for job cuts to outnumber the creation of new jobs? And I think it's fair to say that the job market has slowed, but just not as quickly as we thought it would back when the Fed started raising rates at this quick of a pace. We actually, we just kind of a perfect segue even from the previous kind of discussion of, how do you save in an inflationary environment like this? And often the secret to saving is by finding a job that pays you more money. Making more money really is the secret to beating inflation, which makes it a tough reality because we have seen that wages haven't kept pace with inflation. Right now they're starting to catch up in the race. I kind of think about these two things as, at a starting line as like a horse race. Right out of the gate, inflation took off at a much faster pace. Wages trailed behind. Now inflation is losing momentum. Wages are catching up a little bit, but from an analysis that we did at Bankrate, there's still about a 3 percentage point gap. And Americans, it's one of the reasons why, even though this job market has been so strong, it's one of the reasons also too why Americans aren't really feeling it.
Yeah. So go ahead, Lindsay.
No. Do you think people are less confident that they can find a job right now?
It's interesting because you see data from our Bankrate surveys. We pull job seekers once a year, and we kind of found that Americans who are more worried about their job security, they're actually the ones who are taking steps to maybe bolster their incomes. They're asking for raises. They're hunting for new positions. I think what has been kind of eye-opening is that in the aftermath of the pandemic, you heard narratives of a so-called great resignation where Americans were rethinking, how does my career fit into my life? What do I want out of my job? And even these Americans who are in these tougher service sector positions, they were considered essential workers. They really even also rethought, is this a position that I want to work in? And I think that, the great resignation, whatever you call it, there were remnants of that in the quits rate because we saw a huge share of Americans quitting their positions. Now it's kind of rebalanced a bit back to pre-pandemic levels. But I try to remind Americans that pre-pandemic, 2019, that was a strong job market too. And even back then, it was historically, there were more people quitting their positions than you'd think for Americans who might be worried about a slowdown in the job market.
Well, Sarah, I think you brought up a really interesting point. You mentioned that, in order to help, beat inflation, getting jobs where, you make more money. And I feel like, but practically speaking, for Americans, it's easier said than done, right? It's one of those things like there's a data point, like make more money, you can help beat inflation. But then there's a common person be like, yeah, but I don't know. I don't feel qualified to get a job. I don't feel, that I have the skill set or, depending on what the market is, some jobs are hiring, some are not. But you made a statement that I really want to hit back on where you talked about like how to ask for a raise, because I feel like there's a common theme where people feel scared to ask for a raise. They feel like there's going to be a penalty for asking for it. So I'm just curious, like, are there practical ways that we can help consumers know how to approach asking for a raise or promotion? Like, are there ways that we can help them to think through that process?
Yeah, I often call it, it's about speaking your company's language. It's really important to know the work that you do, how that contributes to your company's bottom line. You know, we like to think that top talent is rewarded, but a lot of the times it's the top talent that is, you know, contributing to the success of the business that often sees the best, you know, rewards in their paychecks. I think that's really important to not only know how to communicate it, but also get comfortable. And I often think back, there are stories sometimes in journalism that really stick with you. And one of the stories that often sticks with me is this piece I wrote a year ago that was talking about younger Americans, how they were actually, they're talking with their coworkers about how much money they make.
Yeah.
And they're approaching these often awkward conversations that older generations kind of shied away from
Hey, it's
because
not older. I shied away from it too. Okay. It's not that
it's
old.
it's taboo, right? It's
Yeah.
taboo to really
100%.
put your face out there, say to a friend, you know, I make this much money. But we have found, you know, success stories anecdotally from other Americans who did kind of approach those uncomfortable topics. They actually found out, you know, that they were underpaid compared to their
Yeah.
peers.
I
And
believe that.
I
that's a
believe
great
it.
way.
I have had this conversation with a few of my close friends. I have to say, I don't have this conversation with every single one of my friends, but a few of my close friends who also work in the same fields of marketing. And I'm talking to them about pay, and they realize that they are severely underpaid, and then go kind of go ask for a raise within their company because they research and find out that they are significantly underpaid compared to other people in their field.
Well, I still think you have the but how like question in your mind,
Yeah.
like how do I approach it? Like it's that uncomfortable because it's been
It
taboo
is.
for so long to talk about. But I think even a simple conversation with your employer, like maybe you're not asking for a raise, but like, hey, what are the steps that I can work towards getting a raise or getting a promotion? Like setting yourself up for success. So asking the questions, not assuming that necessarily your best interest is always at heart. You know, you don't want to make those assumptions. So sometimes you got to figure out, well, what can I put in my hands, and what you can put in your hands is being educated on what you can do to be the best in your role to achieve you higher earnings, things like that. So that's one thing I would probably suggest is just kicking off that conversation. Doesn't have to be about what can the business do for you, but what can you do for the business to earn that as well.
I think something that is often important too in the salary conversation is, I mean, it's kind of one of the reasons why, you know, a lot of younger Americans are discussing their salaries with their coworkers or their friends. It's because you kind of have to know what a good starting point is, what a fair wage is for your position before you even, you know, approach the conversation. I mean, the only way you'll figure out if you're underpaid is if, you know, you ask. And I think one of the reasons, you know, something that we talk about a lot at Bankrate when it comes to getting a salary increase is doing research, because not just within your industry, but also within your geographical region, someone could be paid a different amount based on cost of living adjustments that a company may provide.
Yeah.
And it's
Yep.
just one of the reasons, you know, it's complicated, but it's important. And especially when it comes to, you know, pursuing your financial goals, we want to make sure that everyone is getting a fair wage.
So inflation's been really hard on people's wallets this year, especially for people who are living paycheck to paycheck. I feel like that's been a thing. Is there any like signs that the pay rate and inflation, like, are we starting to close the gap there? Is there at any point in the near future, are we expecting to kind of eclipse it where we can kind of get back on our feet? Like, what's your thought there, Sarah?
So we kind of crunch these numbers here. Like I said before, we love math here at Bankrate. We kind of crunch these numbers though.
Most of us.
We found that if everything continued going the way that it's been going, so if wages continued rising at a faster pace than inflation, we would see that gap completely closed by the end of 2024, which is a long time. And a lot can go wrong between now and then. I think, you know, this is not a forecast for the economy. It's mostly a projection. And if we were to actually see a recession happen between now and then, which we actually just came out with a new economist survey, our latest poll is showing that those odds have fallen to 46%, but still a little bit high. You know, you could see both inflation and wage growth take a sharper nosedive, which kind of calls into the question and the threat of, you know, is it possible for Americans to reap what they lost, you know, close that gap?
Right.
at all.
Yeah.
But I would say that every industry has had a different situation. And we looked at this on an industry by industry level. We didn't project it out, but we did see that some of these industries actually did see increases that not only matched, but beat the overall rate of inflation. Although I will say, retail workers, food services, which are kind of those industries that we saw beat inflation, they were starting from very low wages anyways. So even if you are being inflation, that doesn't necessarily mean you aren't feeling, the consequences of it.
So just out of curiosity, when we're talking about job markets and growth and things like that, is there a way to distill, like, are we creating more jobs, or is it consumers are having to get second jobs? Like, I think that's one of the questions, or side hustles. I feel like those are some of the things we've heard in conversation. And so just curious, when we're looking at this from an economic standpoint, is it job's a job? Doesn't matter if it's your first job, second job, whatever. Is that how it's looked at when we're typically looking at these kind of projections?
Well, I would say that we have run surveys at Bankrate that have looked at the number of Americans who are pursuing side hustles and the number of Americans who say that they think that maybe, a side hustle is probably something I always have to do to be able to afford my lifestyle. And this is a pretty large share of Americans. So I think
Wow.
that it is fair to say that a lot of Americans are pursuing second jobs. But I even, as the economist, from that point of view, I often, at least this economy has the demand for these extra
That's true.
positions that Americans, obviously we would want Americans to be able to afford their everyday expenses with, have a fair wage and live comfortably. But at least, it is important to know that there are options out there. And it's one way that you could take advantage of the strong economy.
And
I
again,
just,
it's not a one size fits all, but maybe one of the steps to avoid a side hustle or getting a second job is to just begin those conversations with your employer about raises. I mean, that could be a way, rather than forcing yourself to work more, is maybe concentrate on what you can do more, even in your own role, have those conversations and potentially avoid needing a second job or a side hustle. And so definitely some great advice there.
yeah, I mean, for me, I have a side hustle, but I like just having that extra cash that I could use for savings or paying down some of my student loan debt. So I think too, it's also something that I love to do. So if you're, what they say, if you do what you love, you never have to work a day in your life.
Yeah,
I also think, Lindsay too, I mean, you're the perfect example of someone who's monetized a hobby. And that's a
Yeah,
great thing to do too. I mean, you're already doing it. So why not get paid to do it,
Yeah.
exactly. Like, why
That's
not
awesome.
just try to make some extra cash along the way?
Yeah.
It's been helpful. I mean, the taxes on it are not great. That's a whole other conversation that we could have, but it's just nice to have some extra money coming in from something that
But
I love to do.
but no matter what you're taxed, you're making something on something you love doing. And so that's
That's
not a
true.
bad thing.
Not a bad thing at all.
More money to put in a high yield savings account.
That's it. That's 100% it.
Oh, that's it. Well, this has been fun. Thank you, Sarah, again for joining us. We had a blast talking with you. You shared a
Absolutely.
ton of insightful advice with us. Again, don't forget to like, share, or subscribe from whatever platform that you're watching on. Ben, tell the people what we've got coming next week.
Absolutely. It's going to be an interesting week. We got the holidays coming up. So we're going to be talking about retail credit cards. We're going to be talking about how to leverage rewards and points for holiday travel shopping. And then we're even going to maybe take a little bit of a stab at some sports betting and the risk associated there. As it doesn't apply to all states, but there are many states that offer. So we'll dive in there. But that's what we got coming up next week. And we'll be having another special guest joining us next week. So be sure to tune in. Again, thank you all for joining. Sarah, thank you so much for coming in and for all your insight. We look forward to having you on again, hopefully soon. And we'll see you all next time.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.